This video is going to look at JavaScript events. So there's lots of different ways that you can add events in JavaScript. So I'm going to go through a number of different techniques and then leave you with what I think is the best of the techniques. And then we'll see what else we can do with events once we've got them set up. Okay, so I'm using the set of files that are available in a zip. It's the lab if you're following along. There'll be some other videos related to this one, but it's a JavaScript DOM and arrays and forms lab. And specifically, I'm going to be looking at this section here on events, which is on page 6. Right, so I've got Visual Studio Code set up. And I've got an index page, and the last thing I was doing in here was I'd attached a JavaScript file. So I've got a JS folder, and inside there I've got my script.js, and this just had a what's known as a immediately invoked function expression, an IFI, which is this construct here, and there was some DOM manipulation things in there to get us going. There's a previous video that covers that. Okay, but so what I wanted to look at is events. So in the index page, which looks like this, you'll see there's a bit of innocence in text there that just says test event. So that's this paragraph tag here, and notice I've given that an ID. So the first way that you can add events is what's known as an inline event. So in JavaScript, you can literally just type in on click. Yes, it's listing them there, loads of them for me there in Visual Studio Code. So I could say on click, and then I could then, in quotes, have the result of that event being triggered. So if I just put in a little console message, so we could say console.info hi. So notice I've got to use single quotes so they don't clash with the double quotes on the outside, because this is a string. So I'll save that and go back, and let's bring the console up in Chrome here. So right click and inspect. There's the console. Take out a mobile view, we're not messing around with mobile stuff here. So when I click on this, it should fire a message. Just refresh in the console. There you go, see the message popping up there in the console as I click. Okay, so that's what's known as an inline event. Now, they're generally not recommended because they do lead to a fair amount of spaghetti code, but you will see them used by other developers as you dig around and look at other examples, but generally it's not something that I would recommend. We're going to show you some other techniques. Where you will find that technique still popular is where on the body you often get an onload event attached to it, and most commonly it's used to call a function called init, and the idea being that when the body, i.e. everything that is visible within the page, is loaded, so it's an onload event, it will call the init function. So there's nothing special about init, it's just a good naming convention. So in my script file here, if I just comment this out for now, we might have had a function called init, and let me put console in there. So console.info hello from init, and what should now happen is that when I refresh the page, you see you get that message. So it's fired that code up because that init function has been triggered. Okay, so I'll draw your attention to that because that use of onload on the body tag is, you do see that used a fair bit, but I'm not going to be using that because if you place the code at the bottom of the document, then the body's already loaded, so you don't need to worry about that. Okay, so that's an init function. Just get rid of that and return back to where we were. Right, so the other techniques that we've got then for an event is if we can target our event, so we know that this is in a paragraph tag and it's got an ID of my test event. So what I could do is I could say document, which is our document object model that represents all of the elements in the document, dot get element by ID, and then I'd need to know the ID of the element I was interested in, which is my test event, and I can put that in there like so, and then we can say dot, and now what we could do is we could say on click. Now on click is a property. You see that Visual Studio Code knows this is a property, which is a little bit unusual because you might think an event is kind of very verby. You might expect it to be a method, but it's actually a property. And what you associate that property with is a function. So we're going to set this equal to a function, and this function is a special kind of function. It's known as an event handler function. So this function is responsible for handling that event, that on-click event. I should mention this is case sensitive, so if you did have it like that, that would cause an error. It is bizarrely all in lowercase. Inline events, of which that was one here from earlier, these are case insensitive, which is another reason to avoid them. But this is what's known as a DOM event, and they are case sensitive. So this function is going to get called as the result of that event being triggered. So let's put a console in. Right, so what should happen now then is that when, if I refresh the page, when I click on here, we've got an on-click event attached to it, and you can see the message being picked up in the console. There's lots of other different events that we can attach to that. So you can see we've got on double click, should be on double click. Show that working. So refresh. I'll need to double click on that now. So one click is not enough. I've got to double click to call it. And there are things like on roll. Let's find a good one. On click. Oh, on mouse. Sorry, on mouse over. Just kind of a hover effect. There you go. See when I roll over it, you can see it being triggered there, like mouse over. Okay, so let me just change that back to on click. So this says what's known as a DOM event. The first technique in here, let's create another one for you. So this is inline. So we'll just put console.info inline. So that's an inline event. Let's just refresh that. So that works, high inline, and that works. I just need to save that. I've got a click event there, so let's refresh. So that's a click, and that's a click. Okay. Difference being this has got the code in the JavaScript file. Makes it easy to debug. This has got the event in line in the paragraph tag. Makes it hard to debug and blends the JavaScript with the HTML, which is never a great idea. Okay, so that's a DOM event. So you will see these as well. Now they're generally preferred method these days is using something called an add event listener. So you'll see them in the PDF. So in the PDF I've just done the inline event, DOM event is the next one, and then this one is the add event listener method. This is the recommended route. Right, so let's just comment that out. Show you one of these. So we say document dot get element by ID, and then we'll target my test event. So as you're just getting used to this is the idea that this is the document object model, represents all the HTML, and we specifically want to target this element because it's got an ID of my test event. We can say get the element by its ID of my test event, and then we can say add event listener. And the way that this works is it's a method rather than a property. So you open up the parenthesis to feed a value in, and the first value is the event type that you want to add. So I'm going to put in a click, it's gone in as a string, and then the second value is a function that represents the event handler. So this is the function that's going to handle the event, it's going to control what happens when the event occurs. So it's a little bit weird first time you see this, because what you're going to do in here is you're going to drop an entire function in as the second parameter. So we're putting a function with a parenthesis, open the curly brace, close it like so. So what I've got there is this function goes in as a complete parameter to this. So what I've got is this function here, a normal function, and what it does is it goes in as an entire parameter for the add event listener method. So let's put a little console message in. So it's a good idea when you're working with events just to put consoles in to make sure they're working. So this is going to be called by the add event listener. Right, let's save that. Give that a whirl. Right, so back over in here, just refresh the browser. So notice, I should mention with JavaScript, I can just work locally. I don't need a server for this. It's all client side. So I'll click on here, and we can see that event being triggered. So you've got a JavaScript event that's created by adding an event listener to that object. That is this paragraph tag here. We referenced it by its ID, and we're saying listen out for when you are clicked. So when somebody clicks on that element, it's going to fire this function and do something. Now that's an example of one with an anonymous event handler, because notice this function didn't have a name. Now you can do this another way, so I'm going to just comment that out. And let's say I create a function that I call button clicked. Okay, and then I open the parentheses for it, and then we put a little console message in there. I was clicked. Okay, so we've got a function called button clicked. Now what we can do is we can use this function as the event handler rather than having an anonymous one like we did in the previous example. Okay, so we'll say document dot get element by ID. So what we're interested in is the my test event element, and then we're going to call the add event listener. That's at the top. That's just because it's alphabetical. So we're going to add an event listener. The event is a click. You can use all the other JavaScript events in there if you wanted to, and then the event handler is going to be button clicked. So notice I don't put any parentheses at the end of that, we just put button clicked, because we are assigning this function to that event to act as its handler. Right, let's refresh it. So we click on this. This is an add event handler, and you see we pick up the I was clicked in the console. So either of these techniques is valid. I've got Prettier installed, which is why I shoved it on separate lines like that, but it's no problem looking like that. Now, an important concept which would work in the DOM event or the anonymous event handler or this last technique here is that what you can do is this function, which is known as the event handler, it can be sent as a parameter, the event itself. So developers have their own little conventions for this. I tend to use EV. So I'm saying that EV is going to represent the event that this function is being triggered by, is the handler for. So in here we could say, well, what does that look like first of all? What is this? Because the event represents the event object. So we do console.dir ev. Let's have a little nosy, see what that looks like. So when I click on here now, I'll see I've got a mouse event, and if I peel that open, there's all kinds of interesting information about that event and where it was triggered and the XY coordinates and all kinds of interesting information. So it's dead handy to be able to know what triggered the event, because in that list somewhere would be event target. An event target tells me who triggered the event. So there's the target, so we could see that the target was a paragraph of my test event. So let's just show that. So if I change it to an info, dir is used for more complex objects. So if we say ev.target, so if I just refresh, so now when I click on this, it tells me that's what I clicked on. I clicked on this paragraph tag. So that's dead handy being able to know what you clicked on, because there's all kinds of neat programming tricks that we can use for that. Now, another important thing about EV is that, let's say that this was not a paragraph tag. Let's say it has a paragraph tag on the outside. But actually inside it's an anchor tag, and let's say it had a href, so it had a hypertext reference that took you to some location. So I've made that now a hyperlink instead of a paragraph tag, but it's still called my test event. Right, so now what you'd expect is that given that's now a hyperlink, when I click on it, it's going to link me to Google. Okay, which is fair enough, that's what you'd expect. But what we can do with JavaScript is, because we've got the event object there, we can say to the event that we want you to call a method called prevent default. So prevent default is a method that belongs to the event object, and that's going to stop the event from doing what it would normally like to do, what its default behavior would be. And in our case here, the default behavior of that would be that it'd want to follow the hyperlink off to the Google website, but we're telling it via JavaScript that nope, you're not going to do that, you're going to be prevented from doing your default behavior. So let's just refresh, I'll click on here, and you see it doesn't take us to Google, even though the link is to Google. It stays there because the event has been captured, and the event has been told it doesn't behave in its default fashion. Okay, so that's the idea of the event object, and there's some information about that in the PDF. But events are used an awful lot in JavaScript. So in summary, you need to find a DOM element. You add an event listener to it to indicate what kind of event you would like, and then you have a function known as the event handler that handles the response to the event. And these special functions, they can be anonymous, they can just not have a name and be dropped in as an entire parameter, or they can be named functions like in this example here. But in either case, you can send the event through as an object. You can expose the event as an object, and that allows you to prevent the HTML from behaving in its normal way. And that shows you how that impacts on the link. The other common technique is to stop a form from submitting, so that you can put some validation in place on the HTML form before it gets submitted. Okay, that's a quick run through of events. And the next little video will have a look at, continue through the PDF, we'll bring in arrays. And I think the idea is that we will do that in relation to changing the, creating a little image slider. So that's up next. Thank you.